Hello everyone, this is Ishan here. In this video I will be talking about Mega Man 2 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Before I start, I should note that after playing the games throughout the entirety of this year, I like to classify myself as a pretty big fan of the classic Mega Man series, specifically for its gameplay. If you were to ask anyone what is the best classic Mega Man game to start with, the most common answer would be Mega Man 2. If you were to ask anyone what is the best Mega Man game in the classic series, the answer might also be Mega Man 2, at least one of. I believe when people are referring to Mega Man 2 as one of the best, it is really due to the fact that it is one of the easier games. It was a simple game in the franchise, and it was praised for the development team to create this game during their free time. My goal is to show how such an overly acclaimed title has many flaws for its final release, more so than any other classic Mega Man game. The problems with Mega Man 2 are usually overlooked because of this. If you have not yet played Mega Man 2, it is probably best that you play it before watching this video. With that said, let's get started. There are two sides of the problems on the same coin that is Mega Man 2, one of which involves the Robot Master portion of the game. The problem lies not within the Robot Master stages, most of them are actually very enjoyable to play through, but the issues are mainly subdued to the weapons of the game. The first of which that comes into everyone's mind are the Metal Blades, which some will say is the best weapon in the series. It is powerful for starters, it can be thrown in 8 directions, and it doesn't use much weapon ammo. The problems, however, has the Metal Blades outshining all of the other weapons, except for the few that have an entirely different purpose. The Bubble Lead is to attack grounded enemies, the Air Shooter is to attack flying enemies, and the Atomic Fire is to one-shot enemies only when it's fully charged up. The Metal Blades takes all of those weapons and shoves it to the corner as if they don't mean much to the player. The Metal Blades can be thrown upwards, downwards, and both level directions. It effectively replaces the Mega Buster as well. If it replaces any of these weapons, what gives a reason for the player to ever go back to them with the exception of certain enemies? It is true that the same goes for Mega Man 1. In Mega Man 1, the player must obtain the Super Arm used to pick up boulders and receive the Magnet Beam from Elecman's stage. However, once they have obtained Elecman's weapon, it renders the Super Arm useless because the Thunder Beam can also destroy boulders. On top of that, the Thunder Beam can also replace the Hyper Bomb, Rolling Cutter, and Firestorm just for the sheer power alone. The difference between the two games and handling the weapons is that the Thunder Beam doesn't hamper that experience. What I mean exactly is the pacing used to complete pretty much any other Mega Man game. The point is for the player to start out against a certain Robot Master they feel comfortable playing against. Once they defeated the level, they will use said Robot Master's weapon against another one. That makes the most logical sense. Once all of the stages are complete, it loops back to the first Robot Master they started where the player notices a pattern. That is not the same with Mega Man 2. On top of being one of the easiest Mega Man games, Capcom still felt the need to aid the player with how Metal Blades are utilized. Let's examine on how stages are treated with its difficulty. Because difficult mode is the default to Japanese players in Wily Wars, I thought it would be interesting to compare the results of which Robot Master is weak to the Mega Buster, the default weapon, and which Robot Master is weak to the Metal Blades. Airman, Quickman, Heatman, and Flashman are bosses who are weak to the default weapon in difficult mode. On top of having that weakness, the other Robot Masters at least have simple attack patterns to manipulate. Bubbleman, Woodman, Flashman, and even Metal Man himself are all weak to the Metal Blades. Already this seems unnecessary because half of the Robot Masters are weak to the default weapon. You can argue that allowing this will encourage the player to start comfortably with any Robot Master as their first choice besides Crashman. However, that's part of the reason why people give so much praise to Mega Man 2, because it was handing the player victory, so there was no reason why the Metal Blades are needed to add that extra crutch to 3 more Robot Masters. The Metal Blades are not the only weapon that is seen as faulty. More specifically, the Time Stopper and Crash Bomber are different enough weapons to stand out on their own, for the better or worse. As the name suggests, the Time Stopper is meant to stop everything in the player's path, whether an enemy or obstacle. However, as soon as the player activates the weapon, there is no way to switch out of it. You can't change the weapon while activated, you can't even pause as long as it's running. It is essentially a one-use item until you have collected enough weapon capsules. That is probably the reason there are weapon capsules during Quickman's infamous piston section. If you decide to use the Time Stopper during this section, you can grab the weapon capsules while the weapon's in use before it's been depleted. Half of the issues the Crash Bomber has is apparent here. Its main use is to destroy barriers that open shortcuts, but once the Crash Bomber is on screen, the player is once again unable to pause, meaning they must wait for it to explode. It's a very arbitrary weapon to use in combat considering its projectile and a weakness to Bubbleman and Flashman. Not being able to shoot another Crash Bomb because one is already on screen is quite frustrating, which is odd on why some enemies are weak to this in the first place. The only time where it's ever been helpful was against this enemy. The other good thing I could say about the Crash Bomber is that it's a decent side special in Smash Bros., but that's it. That might have sounded like a mouthful, but these were minimal game design quirks, whereas the second half of the game lacks in level design, particularly with the bosses. Heading into the first level of Wily Castle, I can at least give the game credit to allow the player to make use out of item 1 and 3, because in Mega Man 1 if you did not get the Magnet Beam, that means you have to backtrack to find the item while doing all of the Wily stages over again. Once the player reaches to the top of the tower, it's off to the first Wily boss, the Mecha Dragon. The build up to the fight actually works because once the player steps on a single block, they would have no other choice but to move forward. Platforming is also needed here, in a platformer, go figure, after the likes of Heatman and Airman stage, which had a lot of jumping. Despite this, the boss fight suffered from one major problem, and that's the battle itself. 3 blocks are only placed during this section, and a knockback for each fireball sends Mega Man 2 tiles back, most likely costing a life. If this was meant to follow the trend of jumping between blocks, then the hitboxes either should have been smaller, or the platform should have been one more tile wider. If the player dies during this fight, the build-up must be repeated, and after a while it decreases dedication to finish this level. Time to fast forward past Wily stages 2 and 3 because they don't really have much issues with the exception of this drop past insta-death spikes, which a lot of Mega Man games are guilty of admittedly. Wily stage 4 on the other hand hold 2 major flaws. By the end of the level there is a poorly placed Sniper Joe between the floor and the ceiling. It is too close between both and there is not enough open space to jump over the bullets. Even if you are able to kill the Sniper Joe, you must move back to avoid the rest of the fired shots, and only then will the enemy respawn. The point is, this enemy placement is unavoidable. What really bugs me, however, is the next Sniper Joe where there is enough room to avoid all the bullets. It's seamlessly reversed and makes an example that the game is testing a player before they even teach. A good example of teaching the player something avoidable in Mega Man 2 is the fall through platforms. In Wily Stage 4 there is a trap where a tile is not solid and the player falls through without much punishment. Then it gets repeated in another screen where the player now learns that this trap will happen at this very moment, while the spikes are not just placed as a detail. This is the kind of level design that should gradually challenge the player, yet it feels like 2 different people worked on both halves. The boss of Wily Stage 4 is known as the Booby Trap. Of all issues aside, it seems like this is generally the most notorious part of Mega Man 2 because it fails to improve both the boss fights and the weapon usage. The only way you can do damage to the Booby Trap is with the Crash Bomber. You have just enough to take down all of them, including one barrier. However, if the player is completely empty with the Crash Bomber, they must cause themselves alive so they can grind for more weapon capsules while sending them back to the Sniper Joe room. The boss room itself is also rather clunky. It's designed to have all the barriers destroyed and maneuvering around the walls to properly shoot each trap. But because that uses more than the required amount of ammo, the best bet is to use item 1, which you need enough ammo for that as well. An alternative method you can defeat this boss is to destroy all the barriers, lose a life, refill the ammo, and come back to the fight with all the barriers already destroyed. I don't see why the boss wouldn't just take any damage from your standard weapon, while having another weapon be his weakness. This just shows what I mentioned earlier, that the Crash Bomber was not meant for offense rather than giving out shortcuts. The worst part is that this design choice happens twice in the game. With the final boss of the Wily Castle being an alien for some reason, it's made as a real pushover. This boss only moves in one pattern and shoots a single bullet every 2 seconds or so. This boss ended up incomplete considering how easy it is, that coming into contact with it costs 1/3 of your health, and that's supposed to be challenging. The worst part about this boss is that he only gets damaged by one weapon, and it's not the Mega Buster. The Bubble Lead is yet another weapon that uses ammo for a boss fight, and it may just be worse here. The alien is not as difficult, but let's put it in this perspective. Say if you have no more Bubble Lead left considering the boss gauntlet and how impatient the final boss can be. You can at least refill the Bubble Lead, you might think. Unfortunately, the last place you respawn is the final area where there are no enemies to confront, just these acid drops you need to avoid. If there's no enemies, there's no other way to obtain weapon ammo. This means if you are out of Bubble Lead, you must waste all of your lives to get a game over, restart the level, and refight the boss full of Bubble Lead at the cost of not just your lives, but your remaining energy tanks as well. This makes me believe that the developers tested this game, thought it played fine, but did not look beyond other elements while doing nothing about it, making the Wily levels more of a chore to play through. Many of the elements mentioned in this video are large mistakes that developers would never go back to. Mega Man 2 was a widely acclaimed title, but only because of its legacy, not because of how it is or currently was. These issues are apparent that it's baffling how people would ignore them, and yet Mega Man 2 is often considered one of the best despite of this. In order to get new players into the series, however, Mega Man 2 can still be considered the best to start with even after watching this video. While the difficulty can ease new players to starting their classic Mega Man journey, in retrospect this also hurts the game. The Metal Blades replaces a majority of the weapons. Its usability on top of the current difficulty makes the game structurally a mess, and the compromises just made the game worse. It's understandable that replaying the game, you don't need to start a new file with the Metal Blades. It's the same method I play as well. It's also understandable that the criticisms I gave Mega Man 2 was unnecessary, considering this game has been out for over 27 years. However, the following games in this franchise do not get as much attention as they well deserve. The simplicity and easy difficulty is something that most fans will take advantage of, which is really why Mega Man 2 is widely popular. The game is not horrible, but is nowhere near great.